Welcome back. This is our final panel of the day. Thank you for sticking with us. This panel is on transitions to transformative AI, and I'm going to turn it over to the co-pilot of this whole project over the year, Seth Lazar.
Thank you, Katie. Okay, so this being the last session, I want to just say how pleased I am with the depth and breadth of the work that our authors and panelists have shared. This is exactly what Katie and I hoped that we would do. And the body of work that's going to be published over the coming weeks, I think really will substantially shape discussions on AI across disciplines. So I want to pause to thank, on everyone's behalf really, the indefatigable Knight team, especially of course Katie. This has been a very challenging year for everybody around here. And the clarity of purpose and moral courage that the Knight Institute provides has just been a real source of inspiration throughout. I also want to thank Seb here for his illustrations, which you've seen throughout the 2 days. There was a time when we were looking at them and we were wondering whether the Statue of Liberty with the cyborg eye was like a bit too dark. Maybe we didn't go grim enough. And I want to also flag that Seb used Midjourney 6.1 to make these images, and it's a really great demonstration, in my view, of how you can have really creative work done with generative AI. So the purpose of this convening was to acknowledge and build from a simple observation that many of the people who have led the way in thinking about how to make AI go well had, at least when we first conceived of the event, failed or refused to update on the scale of progress in AI constituted by the advances with large language models. Out of what was an intellectually diverse and forward-looking field of research, action, and practice, a kind of anti-AI faction had emerged and taken center stage, the central tenets of which were to imply that there's nothing to see here, none of our proposed interventions really need to accommodate any changes in the technology, and basically that everyone making advanced AI should just stop it. From day one, many of us who work on responsible AI have rejected this approach, but at the same time, those who really were focusing on where AI progress was heading were not offering a particularly attractive alternative. So their approach that is often brought together under the heading of AI safety sometimes seemed ignorant of even the recent history of AI governance, let alone the broader history of navigating technological change. It was typically very narrowly technical in orientation, and it failed to draw on the expertise of other fields outside of computer science, frankly, even outside of AI. Like basic tenets of cybersecurity, such as the sociotechnical nature of all threats, were largely ignored for a spell. And it focused narrowly on one possible outcome from very capable AI systems, namely kind of AI kills us all. So the aim was to bring the methodology that has enabled significant progress on understanding and regulating narrow AI systems to bear on the coming general AI systems. As we described at the time, Alondra and I in an op-ed in 2023, to take a socio-technical approach to AI safety. So due to the work of many people who have been part of this symposium, as well as many people not here, and especially due to the efforts of many brilliant PhD students who are kind of untethered to the factions of the past, this research agenda has really progressed admirably over the last 18 months. Our hope is that the papers from this convening will catalyze it still further. But there's definitely still more to do. And part of that involves acknowledging that as far as AI has come in the last 3 years, it's not decelerating. And we need to think ahead to capabilities and impacts that significantly transcend even what we're currently experiencing. In short, we need to adopt a socio-technical approach to AGI. Now, I did call this session Transitions to Transformative AI because I wanted the language to be kind of inclusive of different approaches and perspectives. But personally, I do think that we need to be thinking explicitly about AGI. So AI systems that are domain general, equal to or better than human expert level in each domain, and role autonomous, so able to kind of select tasks for themselves rather than just kind of undertake a task that you give it, like you might do with deep research, say. So the goal of this panel is to think through possibilities like this within that kind of broader methodological approach of the whole symposium. Okay, one of the constraints I did propose to the panel as I was kind of bringing this together was that we wouldn't focus so much on the kind of long tail of possible outcomes from AGI, and in particular on the most extreme of them. These have dominated, like I said, a lot of AI safety discussion, perhaps to a lesser degree in the last 6 months. And while I think they can't be dismissed, I also think that the prospect of AI causing human extinction or something of comparable severity is a kind of black hole for discussion of AI impacts. It sucks everything else in, allowing no further illumination. There's definitely, there's a good case for some people working on making sure that at some point AI doesn't kill us all. But most of us really also should work on what we should do if it doesn't, either because that turns out not to be a realistic technological prospect, or because we figure out ways to anticipate and prevent it. So I had the pleasure of picking just the people who I would want to talk about this topic with. So we've got Justin Bullock, Rumman Chowdhury, Seth, Krier, and Sam Manning, and I'll introduce them each in turn, and then we'll begin the broader discussion. So Justin's a scholar of public administration working on AI. His career has taken him through academia, through to becoming a VP of policy at Americans for Responsible Innovation, and a senior fellow at the Convergence Analysis Research Group, as well as back into academia with the Evans School of Governance at the University of Washington. Among other notable contributions, he edited a mammoth Oxford Handbook on AI governance that I highly recommend to everyone. Rumman Chowdhury has a storied history of work in responsible AI, leading the pioneering machine learning ethics, transparency, and accountability team at Twitter, the original Meta, as it was before it was bought by Elon Musk, subsequently launching Humane Intelligence, which has led massive participatory red teaming events and consulted with governments and international organizations on the societal impacts of generative AI. She's also a veteran of the very online wars of early 2023 about the limitations of the rejectionist approach to AI ethics and safety, in some ways a cause of all of this. Seth Krier leads policy development and strategy at Google DeepMind. He previously served in the UK government's Office for Artificial Intelligence as the head of regulation, where he led the world's first comprehensive review of AI in the public sector. He's contributed to many landmark papers on AI safety and governance, and is also a world-class poster and blogger. He's honestly the best thing left about X. And as I said, he provided the illustrations for this event, and also for his blog posts. He just does wonderful things with Midjourney. And Sam Manning is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Governance of AI, having previously worked at OpenAI on the economic impacts of GPTs, that landmark paper that GPTs are GPTs, and as well as on a randomized controlled trial of guaranteed income programs in the US. He's offered some of the most insightful and well-grounded perspectives on the labor market impacts of general-purpose AI. Okay, so with that introduction, I want to start by just level setting on what we're talking about and giving you all a chance to challenge my initial framing. So I will go to you in turn. I want to keep things loose. This is the end of a 2-day thing, and I want to encourage you to kind of respond to one another. I have some questions that will spark things off. But I want to start just by eliciting some of your high-level heuristics for thinking about all of these problems, as well as explicitly inviting you to challenge my framing. You all have a lot of experience working on AI. You've all been around the traps. What mistakes do you think that people are making? What theoretical tools do you think that we can usefully deploy here? And let's start with you, Seb.
Does this work? Yeah. So I'm not too clear on what exactly, what kind of theoretical tools to use. I do think there are a lot of different abstractions, analogies, or metaphors that people use for AI or AGI, and they're all kind of right and wrong in some respects. Some people use nuclear, some people use oil, and I think none of them are perfect, but they all kind of are useful to some degree for different contexts and settings. And I think the thing I take out of that is that depending on where I'm talking and what I'm talking about, I try to keep some flexibility in the way I think about the technology. Particularly as it's a technology that I think changes very fast, evolves very fast, takes a lot of different form factors. I think a few years ago, people usually kind of equated AI with chatbots, and then there's many applications of AI in science, for example, that were completely ignored in the popular discourse. So I think it's a very, very large concept, essentially, and so I'd encourage, when we talk about AI, to look at very much, the context, the setting, the sector, the application that we're thinking of. And then in terms of, kind of mistakes that people sometimes do when thinking about AI, I think you mentioned, people who make the claim that AI is nothing, it just stops here, it kind of doesn't do anything interesting, or people who just claim that, next week everything is completely different. And I think, I certainly think there's more to the latter view than the former. I'm fairly bullish on AGI and think that it will indeed be a paradigm shift over the coming decade. But equally, I think the transition matters quite a lot, and I think is often under-theorized. And even within that, even when people do look at the elements of this kind of transition to AGI, there's sometimes an over-indexation on past frameworks, static frameworks that kind of aren't really applicable to AI or AGI, like for like. So, the way we thought about social media regulation, for example, or the way sometimes economists think about things like labor automation. There are many kind of frames and heuristics and assumptions that I think will change as the technology gets better. And so, once again, I think, it's important kind of keeping a flexible mindset, I guess, when looking at AGI or AI.
Yes, I think building on some of Seb's points, first is even just the definition of AGI, and I'm not going to jump to like any sort of extreme things, but actually one thing I do find interesting as a social scientist is many of the definitions seem to revolve around like economic output and productivity, which is very fascinating because to the layperson, a lot of this sort of existential fear they have of they're going to lose their jobs, or actually often I talk to undergrads who don't know what to major in school or whether or not their profession will exist. Grounding this concept of intelligence in economic productivity is sort of a problematic construct to begin with. If we look at just fields of intelligence, and again, other fields that have studied human intelligence, animal intelligence, insect intelligence, it is very, very rarely actually around productivity or production. It is more actually around interactive relationships and relationships with environment, which is, unsurprisingly, where AI does tend to fall apart, which is why so many of us are at the stage of talking about sociotechnical, right? AI in context. It's also very interesting to use AI agents, right? I just got my my like free trial or whatever of Manus AI, which was the one that sort of grabbed all the headlines a few weeks ago because, and if you're unfamiliar with it, it grabbed all the headlines because they're like, oh, well, it's the first AI agent model that can think, reason, and take action on its own. Like theoretically, sure, but not in the way that a human being sort of contextually understands the things around them. But it is a very useful tool to use. So I think if we're thinking about not this like future magical state, we're not thinking about literally AI even today, or maybe even AI like 5 years from now. But I think the most interesting question is where will we be in this transformative period, right? Where you do see things like there is a decline in programming jobs because of how good coding agents are. They are quite good. There is now, I was introduced this week to the terms vibes coding, which I've decided is banned from Humane Intelligence. I could not think of a more Gen Z term than vibe coding. But what vibe coding pretty much is this new wave of creative directors of programming, essentially people who don't know how to code, who use agents to code apps and products for them. The thing is, like, it does a reasonably decent job. I don't want to throw it out the window because it is an amazing opportunity for more people to engage in a field without having to learn, a lot of programming, et cetera. But of course, you will see a lot of pushback from senior developers saying, well, you don't understand what this thing is doing, right? So I do think there's this very interesting exploration we need to have as a society, how we define these terms, understand these terms, because, words have weight. If we decide intelligence is defined by economic productivity, then that is something we need to sit with as a society. But number two, that these tools are not useful. Like, they are actually useful things that will have economic impact. And again, as dumb as the term vibe coding sounds, it is already having an economic impact.
Thank you, Justin.
I hate to disappoint you, but there's also vibe governing, which is becoming a term as well.
Probably not.
So we're going to draw the line. So I take a few different lenses to thinking about this. So my background is in public policy and public administration. So I come from this governance lens as my primary lens for thinking about these things. So one framing that sticks with me is this principal agent lens when we think about our tools. So how do we get our tools to represent our interests in broader society? It's parallels what you see from legislative branches and bureaucracy. It's kind of influential for me. Another one is history. We go back to AI as a field in the 1950s, and it's really helpful for me to go back and read stuff that Norbert Wiener said, John von Neumann, and Herbert Simon, who's my own, favorite of the lot, and what they thought about technology at each stage. And it reminds me a little bit to be kind of humble and that these things are also embedded in a historical context, which I think sometimes in the excitement we forget. The third thing that that really influences me in this space is trends we can observe. So Seb and I have a new paper out where Seb makes the arguments very clearly, I think. You can look at, Our World in Data has this nice chart where you can see all these different skills that 20 years ago AI couldn't do, and now they can do a lot of them at human level. And you can look at things like scaling laws. They're not perfect, but you can see trends over time. You can look at Moore's Law and see these trends over time. So, these don't suggest that the future is deterministic, but they suggest that if we zoom out a little bit, we can have some insights onto what the trajectory has been, and it means things are going to have to go in a different direction for the trend to end. And so those kind of three things together really help inform my views of this. In terms of traps, I think, like maybe every other topic, there are camps. And people get a little carried away with being in their camps. So for those of you familiar with these spaces, you have EACs, you have effective accelerationists, you have DACs that are defensive accelerationists, you have doomers, you have pausers, you have these groups of folks that attract people to their camp, and those camps have a really hard time updating their priors over time. Because they get very excited about their specific policy approach, their specific take, and this field and this area is changing quickly. To Seth's point earlier, people still think of these as chatbots, and we're very much past the page where chatbots are the best way to think about these tools. And one final thing that reminds me of is I think people are really not thinking about the multimodality of these systems too, because a lot of us get captured by words. And Seb's images with Midjourney make this point a little bit, but you can look at video and audio generation and robotics and see that these methods are generalizing outside of words into images, into audio, into video. And I think this is something that people aren't really thinking through yet.
Can I actually quickly add something really quick to what you talk about multimodality? Laura Weidiger from DeepMind had a great paper, it was almost 3 years ago at this point, that looked at the gaps in evaluations and basically showed that most evaluations were done on large language models, and most evaluations were done on a few narrow use cases, like gender and race, and pretty much that was about it. So to your point, I think that problem is pervasive, to what Seth is talking about where are these traps are falling into. Everybody very quickly is let's evaluate large language models. My organization, our platform does multimodality. We have yet to have anybody ask us to red team images. Every single client, every single group that has ever shown up, everybody asked to red team LLMs. And we don't actually have good evaluation methodologies for voice generation, et cetera, because even though those are the places where the most fraud is going to occur, and has occurred actually, probably the most expensive fraud that has occurred has been voice generation. And we have not yet developed modalities for auditing those things or evaluating those models because everyone is so hooked on the idea of a chatbot talking to them.
On to you, Sam.
Yeah, so I think building on some of what Justin said and some of what Seb said too, I think it's tempting to try to predict what's going to happen with AI and what the future is going to look like. And I think it's just worth stepping back a bit and thinking historically, if we had tried to do that with previous general purpose technologies at this stage of their development, how well we would have been able to kind of predict the economic and social kind of evolution and change that they would have brought about, where only a couple years down the road at most of having, advanced LLMs that you can access through an API and build lots of new technologies on. And so we have this challenge where it's really tricky to predict how general purpose technologies, what other innovations and changes they're going to spawn. But we see these trend lines and these investments and all of the energy being put into this, and are in this position now where we feel given the implications of some of the goals of the people kind of leading the development of these systems, we need to try to predict and do some sort of anticipatory policy thinking, preparedness, and it's this challenge of like, we can't really see the future, what's going to happen, but we have to try to plan for it and somehow. And this is tricky. One of the traps, I think, is thinking, I think it seems like intuitive maybe or easy to think that achieving some level of capabilities is going to map on one-to-one to sort of real-world impact and economic impact out in the world. And I think that's a trap that people can often fall into, where there's just going to be lots of sort of, very complex sort of pressures pushing in both ways to sort of push those capabilities out into the world, with then lots of different counterweights pushing against them that will kind of create this complex, hard to predict nature of how change in the economy, change in society plays out. And so, this kind of disconnect potentially, between capabilities on a chart, or, the relationship between training compute and benchmark performance, and how these systems will actually then play out into the economy as they diffuse, is a disconnect I see sometimes.
Thanks, Sam. That sets us up nicely for the next question. I mean, because I wanted to just sort of, like, one of the things that is obviously tricky with any of this is just making sure everyone's talking about the same thing. And I think there's an interesting kind of illustration of the point that you're making in the two different framings I've offered for this conversation. On the title, Transitions to Transformative AI, and in the setup, I'm talking about AGI. I think AGI is essentially a description of capabilities. It's about, and it's an understanding of intelligence that, is one way or another kind of drawn from cognitive science and then popularized. Whereas transformative AI is fundamentally about impacts. Now, one of the things I wanted to do with this panel was to really sort of focus us on the question of transitions. And you could say that there's a sort of a transition that would go from here to AGI to transformative AI, if you like. But like the best kind of, or one of the necessary things for thinking about a transition is actually to sort of take stock of the features of like the world now, the world into which these systems will be deployed and developed, and sort of figure out what are the features of our current political economy, for example, that will shape and govern that transition. So I'd like to sort of just zoom out from the technology to the broader sociotechnical context and ask you, especially, Rumman, you've been doing a lot of work with governments lately, especially at the international level. When you think about the kind of the geopolitical position we're in, what kind of a course do you think that sets us on for further technological progress?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a conversation I've been having quite a bit lately. Obviously, the current geopolitical climate that, with the United States taking basically a zero regulatory stance, and also a lot of the language shifting entirely to national security and away from a lot of the more sociotechnical implications, has blocked a lot of people from doing work that they were hoping they were going to do with different governments. However, on the other end, I think it has opened up pathways of opportunity for other actors or players that would have either waited for, let's say, the U.S. government to take a lead on it, or, just relying on the existing geopolitical climate. So that's a very complicated way of saying, like, everything is in flux right now, but in change, I mean, if the topic of this is transitions, in transition, like, one can capture opportunity. Just as an example, the Singaporean government has taken quite a stance on, AI assurance and responsible AI. They have done so for many years. In a geopolitical climate where the U.S. was driving the narrative, if this were, for example, a Harris administration instead of a Trump administration, Singapore's role globally would look very different. In a world in which there is now a massive vacuum, where the U.S. has stepped back from a lot of those interventions that they were previously doing, I'm curious to see what happens. So one of the things that was set up last year, for example, was the International Network of Safety Institutes. The U.S. was leading it for the year, and then another country is supposed to take over. Now, I'm curious to see with so many safety institutes being set up in India, Korea, Kenya, more, what role majority countries, i.e. non-Western countries, will play in pushing for more of a global representation. And again, the air would have been a little bit sucked out of the room if the U.S. were still sort of progressing as it was. Not that, again, it's not a good thing for many people. I don't want to diminish the adverse impact it has had on many, but it's interesting to see certain different players and different actors stepping up to be part of this conversation. Also, one big trend for 2025 that I'm seeing in the geopolitical landscape is just this conversation around science, right? Evaluations. What does it mean to conduct scientific evaluations? I had an op-ed earlier this year in the Krier Herald where I pretty much said that most of our evaluations are, speaking of vibes-based evaluations, where, we have like this thing we want to test and we kind of gather the people to do it. And then if you bash against a generative AI model for long enough, it'll kind of do the thing you want it to do, right? But what does it mean to create scientifically sound and valid if we look at the very basic principles of what science is, things that are reproducible, right? None of these evaluations are reproducible. Things that are generalizable, very hard to make them generalizable. So how can we then communicate about it? We don't even have common shared protocols. Some of the most interesting things that I think we're going to see coming out of the global regulatory landscape may be interoperable methods of approaching evaluation. So if I say my model works in some X language that has some meaning from an evaluation perspective, there are certain specific evaluations I've done that are not just about, is it performant in a language, to your point about capabilities, but how is it interacting in the world, right? Does it quote unquote think like somebody who's a native speaker of this language? That's very different from saying it performs capably in writing at a 10th grade level in some new language.
Thank you. So, Sam, it's a similar question to you, but in the context of labor markets. Like, one of the things that really strikes me about a lot of the more sort of doomy perspectives we have on AI, and we've had plenty of those over the last couple of days, is that they often sort of don't perhaps pay quite enough attention to the fact that the situation like now is, on the whole and across a wide range of different domains and sectors, like shit. And so, like, we're not looking at, it's not the situation where like technologies are going to kind of cause like terrible outcomes that aren't currently happening. So I think in the context of the impact of transformative AI on jobs and like how we get from here to there, like at the moment, for example, in the United States, there are plenty of people who have to work multiple jobs just in order to pay rent. And so how do you think about the interaction between kind of labor markets, I suppose I'm particularly focusing on the West, but more broadly, if you have thoughts on that too, and the prospect of increased automation?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you look internationally, there's people have very different perspectives on AI's potential for the economy and for work. I think in the West, there's lots of kind of fear about automation of jobs, and in many other parts of the world, I think you see more excitement about the potential to use AI to drive growth and things like this. And so, yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned, it's kind of where it's hard to predict where this technology is going to go for the labor market. I think the thing to bet on is that there's going to be, very wide-ranging impacts, and that this is going to change the demand for different types of skills. But this will vary quite a bit across occupations. I think we have lots of and sectors. So we have evidence now that you see in these sort of predominantly like white-collar jobs, productivity gains are increasingly concentrated among the less experienced workers, those who have kind of lower skills in jobs like paralegal work or in software development jobs, in call center work and things like this. And people who are kind of entering a field are able to gain relatively more of a productivity boost than higher skilled workers. And I think this then presents us also this quite international. If you zoom out internationally, this is kind of interesting because it suggests that, maybe through a transition period here, lots of international work that can be done remotely. People who typically are working in labor markets where they can demand lower wages might actually be able to start to compete with workers in New York City. If you're a paralegal in New York City and you're making, $100,000 and you went to law school or something like this, and now this technology is allowing people to gain skills quicker, or at least kind of augment their productivity in these white-collar work around the world. These labor markets for remote work start to kind of converge, and it creates this very complex dynamic that through a transition, could be opportunity enhancing for some folks and then kind of opportunity diminishing for others. And we kind of need to, as to Seb's point earlier, try to figure out how we can design adaptable, flexible policy given sort of the very complex, effects here, differential across workers, and the way things are probably going to change quite rapidly. Yeah.
Can I offer like 3 papers that I think have been really good on this whole future of work narrative? The first actually is the GPTs or GPTs paper. I thought that was really great. I actually still reference it quite a bit. It just did a really great job of sector specific, right? Like people want to know verticals. The second is a paper that came out last year by a very well-known labor economist, if you are of that space, Darren Acemoglu, which looked more at global total factor productivity, which is also very interesting because it kind of gets at some of the points that were just made about what is going to be this global impact on the market, how will labor markets shift, and again, the big point that paper pointed out is that usually most automation impacts blue-collar jobs. This is the first time we're really seeing knowledge jobs being impacted, right? The third paper actually just came out 2 weeks ago, so I love these 3 papers because the Acemoglu's paper is very big, and then the GPT's paper is very let's look at industries. And this third one just came out a few weeks ago from, I think it's Harvard Business School, and they work with Procter & Gamble. And they basically did this competition at P&G with almost about 1,000 people. And they divided, it was as an experimental design person, it spoke to my heart because it was designed very well. People were split up into these groups and they tested, and the testing was much more comprehensive. So they looked at, individuals using AI, teams using AI, individuals not using AI, teams not using AI. And they tested for things not just speed to completion, but also quality of output. And also specifically to what you're talking about is if somebody is not skilled at a particular task, how does AI help them? Versus if somebody is skilled at a task, how does AI help them? So I don't want to spend too long jabbering about it, but you can find it online. I thought it was a very, very well done paper. So if you are interested in kind of the empirical evidence, because if we're talking about transformations, we're in a very interesting transformational time because the gap, if we're looking at time frame, GPTs came out 2023 beginning, right? Yeah, so a couple of months after, the big generative AI revolution, right? The Acemoglu paper came out last year, and then this other paper just came out a few weeks ago. So we're actually seeing this transformation in real time. We could not have done this experiment with the P&G people 2 years ago when this other paper came out, right? So it's, if you want to just sort of read the empirical evidence on it, those are the 3 that I have found to be helpful in shaping my perspectives.
Yeah, +1 to these papers. I'll add a few more authors and people in the list. I think there's a lot of great work done by Epoch, who kind of do a lot of data collection, analysis on the expected impacts of AI as well. And I think one thing that's complicated with AI is that the capabilities of these systems change a lot. So if you did some analysis 2 years ago and based your paper on the fact that the image generators didn't do fingers right or something, you'd probably be, the paper would be obsolete very quickly. So you do also have to have a forward-looking kind of approach. And the problem with some papers or some approaches is that some of the economists make assumptions about the capabilities and make assumptions that these are kind of almost fixed. And I think this sometimes affects the results quite significantly. And of course, determining or trying to predict, how far will the capabilities go and how to kind of model this is a difficult question. And this is why I'm actually very happy to see that this year there's a lot more work going on kind of the economics of AI and AGI and the impacts this may have on labor, on growth, and so on. And you have very, very different predictions here. You have people like Tamé Besoroglu, Jaime Sevilla, you have people like Anton Kornek, Carl Frey, who all do a lot of interesting analysis and really unpack a lot of these assumptions. So I think if you look at the work of Acemoglu and Otter, for example, I disagree a little bit with some of the assumptions behind the models used for where the capabilities will go and to what extent you can extrapolate from the empirical trends we've seen with other technologies in the past. I guess my claim is that this is not always a like-for-like comparison. One thing I'll also then add is that the way I kind of think about transformative AI or these economic transformations is that I separate on the one hand capabilities, which I think are things you observe in vitro in evaluation settings, in kind of simulated settings, from deployments, which is extracting these capabilities and using them in value-adding ways, in productive ways, in wider commerce, and that's difficult. That requires new products, product market fit, adoption, diffusion. These things are complicated and depend on a lot of other factors. And then even then, you still don't have the economic impacts. That still depends on a lot of other elements, the wider sociotechnical approach you've mentioned, things like, wider regulations, the attitudes towards them, the kind of resistance to these technologies or their adoption, or, how they're used in different countries, the kind of competitive effects you'll see. And I like that Sam mentioned, the different approaches to adoption and the technologies across the world. Because I do think there's also an element of looking at the demographics of the countries that are, impacted by this. And so if you look at Europe, for example, I think there's an aging population, and that is presenting a big challenge on the labor markets in Europe. If you look at South Korea as well, I think if you look at the demographics there and look at, trend lines going forward, you need, the automation, the robotics, and the AI in order for, the country to keep on growing. And so, yeah, I think there's just quite a lot to look at here, and I'm just, very happy that this is being unpacked more and more. And, yeah.
Sam, I'm gonna go on to Justin in a moment, but if you have a last thought on this?
Sure, yeah, just one big picture view on this too. So there's a few things we're talking about here. One is this transition piece and basically trying to do this empirical thing of like, can we better pinpoint where this labor market disruption is going to happen so that we can have more foresight, build more resilience and preparedness around these changes. Then there's the long-term thing of what do we do when you have these, AGI, when you've gone through this transition, and this is a whole another big picture question. On the long, the sweeping transition to that, the main, labor market economic trend that is assumed there is that economic value production is shifting from labor to capital, to the owners of AI capital, right? And this then, I think, is like this is something that, David Otter worries about, all the people that you just mentioned kind of will recognize that this is a thing to be, have on your radar as a big picture trend that then spills over into impacts on democracy, political empowerment, all the types of themes that we talked about in this, throughout the last 2 days here.
Thank you. So that sort of connects up nicely to what I wanted to ask you about, Justin. So in your paper on AGI and the Free Society, which just came out, which I also recommend to everybody, you talk about the prospective role of governments in using these technologies. So in this context of thinking about kind of going from here to there, the current uses of technology by governments to enable more effective public administration, but also as Eric was just telling us about, to better control resistance and prevent and sort of identify people to deport, for example. How do you see the sort of the coming years of transition towards AGI interacting with the public use of AI by governments for the purpose of public administration and control?
It's a good question. And to be clear, Seb's a co-author on this paper as well, so I'll take the easy part and then I'll pass to you.
I'm going to ask Seb about tech companies.
Yeah. So, the way we think about this in our paper, we mentioned Daron Acemoglu. He has a framework thinking about the narrow corridor. And it's this idea about how do we end up with free and open societies. And to have free and open societies, you need some kind of balance between state power and non-state power. That if you have too much state power, you have what he calls a despotic leviathan. If you have not enough state power and either the public more generally or corporations have relatively too much power, then you end up in an absent leviathan. And his argument and our argument is that both of those are bad. But alongside that, you can think of a lot of ways that government itself, or at least if you like to think about public administration, you can think a lot of ways that AI might be used by governments. So, there's a lot of concerns here that have been highlighted throughout the time here, but there's also a lot of opportunities. So there, one of the things that we might think about that's really a piece of this is identifying and making payments to people better and helping minimize things like fraud and abuse that you would care about in a society. There's also this concern, one major concern, which in our paper, Sam Hammond really spearheaded this line of reasoning, but as legibility gets easier. So this come up in Erica's talk earlier in the closing remarks, or in the keynote, that governments have more inspectability. They can see what people are doing. And this has a lot of concerns for surveillance. So one of the more, I guess, offshoots of this that I think is kind of interesting that we can look forward to with AGI is organizations that are AI native organizations. So you can imagine that as we get something like AGI can perform lots of roles that a human would typically have performed in an organization. And there's some interesting work out there by Eric Drexler and some others that looks at, we might end up with this AGI type thing where it's really a accumulation of narrow AIs that have a specific role or personality or responsibility, and they have like an organizational structure, just like a university does or like a bureaucracy does. And what would be nice about this is you could inspect the inputs and outputs of each individual AI within this larger collective. And so it still allows for things like oversight, human oversight, inspectability, instead of this kind of black box that a lot of our current LLMs are. You could have them interact with other LLMs, inspect their inputs and outputs, and point them in a direction to achieve goals for society. So again, delivering payments is one that comes to mind. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of opportunity for sufficiently powerful AI to replace certain government functions that had historically been done by humans. And we already are doing some of this. So like in some of my work in public administration, we think about street level bureaucracies, which is kind of like the police officers out on the beat, to screen level bureaucracies, which is where they started spending more time inputting things in databases and being behind screens, to systems level bureaucracies, where the actual algorithms themselves are making a lot of the decisions, which we already have a lot of in government. And you could imagine AI being better at that than the current algorithms. And so you kind of expand this logic that more and more types of services could be provided more efficiently, more equitably, and more effectively if you get the technology itself right.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, so one of the things that Ben said yesterday really struck me, and I think is really important to kind of hold on to, is the point that many of the serious advances in technology over the last 100 years have been led by, particularly the US government. He didn't mention it, but as I said, the Australian government as well has one. And this obviously is not the case with what's currently happening with AI. Now, various people on this panel have experience or are currently working with the technology corporations that are driving this forward and are prospectively going to bring into the world, as Demis Hassabis has described it, that sees their role as being to shepherd AGI into the world. This obviously raises a lot of questions, and I'd just like to talk a little bit. So from this perspective of transitions to transformative AI, it seems as though that transition is going to be largely substantially steered by very large technology companies. And Seb, without putting you too much on the spot, how do you think about these things? I'd like you in particular to reflect on both the current political economy we have and the degree to which there is an opportunity or not at this moment to kind of reduce, for example, market concentration through various different initiatives that might favor, for example, public AI or more decentralized AI systems. And I'd like you to comment on that as well, please.
Yeah, thanks. I love easy questions. So I think the first thing I'd say is that I don't think these companies are operating in some sort of legal vacuum where they can kind of just do whatever they want and just they employ some crazy thing and then just see what happens. I do think there are a lot of laws. There's a lot of kind of tort law, negligence law, liability law, consumer protection frameworks, antitrust frameworks, and so on that do govern how companies actually kind of develop and deploy these technologies. So I wouldn't say it's a kind of thing that just private companies just put out there and then and hope for the best or something. The other thing I'd say is that, I think there's, as Justin mentioned, I think there's a lot of possibilities and opportunity for this to be actually used to enhance, democratic kind of engagement. I think yesterday MH Tesla was discussing the Habermas machine kind of paper but there's many more, ideas I think I have and others have on how, for example, agents could eventually be used to help enhance the agency of people using them to advocate for their interests, for example, or for making the kind of machinery of government a lot more responsive to the demands of people and so on. So I think this is...
You have a really nice example in one of your papers on the idea of sort of making regulations a bit more specific to the particular needs of individuals. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know if that was a paper or a tweet, but
It's also in the paper.
Right.
You did a very nice tweet about it.
Right. But I think basically there are, one way I like to think about this technology is assuming you do have some sort of highly capable agent, whether kind of AGI-like or not, is what could you do that you otherwise could not be doing, if you just had humans kind of just doing the whole thing. And I think that agent in this technology, and particularly if it's kind of, cheap and efficient to use, allows you to do many things that otherwise would be kind of impossible. And that reduces the kind of types of principal agent problems that, we've been discussing. I'm trying to think of an example now, but I think, there was, we often have laws that are very blunt, right? They're kind of, they're just there, and they're supposed to be an average of what we deem kind of broadly acceptable in many situations. I think one example I had, it was, I think it was in London. It was there's a limit at 11 p.m. is the sound limit for everyone or something, and
it's worth pointing out that Seb's also a DJ.
Yeah, so I'm really against these sound limit laws, but there are many ways I think of which you can through these agents have some sort of Coasean democracy. I think it was Ronald Coase who wrote up with this stuff, where you can have a lot of micro negotiations on specific requirements or something that help people negotiate micro contracts through these agents in ways that would otherwise have been dealt with some sort of kind of blunt law that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. And I think in this example it might be something like I'm throwing a party, neighbor is not too happy. Either I get have to pay some sort of compensation to them or something, or there's micro negotiations going on through these agents to help find the optimal kind of balancing of these different interests at play. And all of these kind of types of negotiations would not be really possible with humans. It just makes no sense. There's no time. There's no kind of bandwidth. Whereas if people have loads of kind of agents at their disposal, a lot of this stuff can happen much quicker. Now, of course, this is quite hypothetical and depends on certain capabilities that we certainly do not have yet, and the infrastructure being built. But I'm fairly optimistic about government enabling that and using that, and doing so to enable kind of people and their agents or the agents of government to have better responsiveness to kind of the demands of everyday people.
Rumman, so yes, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, like both in the context of broader corporate control, but also like early on in the in 2023. You sort of launched some calls for international governance of AI. I'm curious about your views in particular on some of the proposals over the last year for public AI systems. So going less focusing on the governance part to focusing on the building part to make sure that it's not only very large companies that are building the most capable systems.
Right. Well, and to maybe bring in a non-Western nation perspective into this, most of the more sophisticated AI systems that will be built in global majority countries will be funded by, if not built by, governments. So it's actually going to be almost the opposite problem, where it's not going to be corporate capture or corporations and governments. It will just be government funded and built. Which, of course, if you think of the constraints of a country like, for example, Malaysia, who would be building this? In India, for example, you're seeing encouragement of startups to be developed, but again, it's being funded through the government, which I will add is not an unfamiliar model in the United States. As much as we would love to think that everybody in Silicon Valley was just an individual captain of industry, the US government has funded so much of the technology infrastructure, right, that we are built on, including the early internet and things like that. So what's fascinating about the conversation is that at the end of the day, it probably will be these few frontier model companies that will still be rolling out the most sophisticated models. They simply have the funding, the resources, the talent, et cetera. However, I'm curious to see how in this era of sovereign AI, so to, back to the geopolitical conversation, because of increasing tensions geopolitically, many countries have decided to just try to build their models on their own, versus, again, in a different world, there would still be increased reliance on big frontier model companies. So now we're seeing a bigger push for sovereign AI, and this kind of leads to the public AI conversation. So there is a lot more conversation on investing in whatever you want to call it, a digital public infrastructure for AI, many different initiatives. We will this year be seeing things coming out of the World Bank. We would have seen things coming out of USAID, RIP. We will see things coming out of the United Nations as well. What's really fascinating to me, two things. One, a conversation we never had back, when I had that article about we need international governance. we never actually discussed whether or not governance should be defined on country borders and definitions. We just kind of assumed it would be. I think it would have been a fascinating thought experiment to just not have it be that way, because all of the sort of international baggage that exists in the world now gets dragged into the AI world of governance, making it even more complicated than it is going to be anyway. So on top of the economic situation, now we will have, for example, discussions that are... I will try to make this as general of a comment as possible. Because I kind of can't share a lot of the details of it, but it's certain governments are withholding doing certain things to evaluate AI models or roll out more stringent evaluations of models because of concerns of what's happening with like the tariffs conversation, right? And this is the world we live in where you have to take everything into account. So that kind of impacts the ability for global institutions to really move forward in a more aggressive manner.
Thank you. So one of the things that I think is was especially unproductive about some of the discussion in early 2023 was that there was a very big and constant sort of framing of like, how much should you worry about AI? And there were big statements on risks that were really focused on, we need to be worried about X, Y, and Z. It was all sort of consciousness raising. And one of the things that sort of puts me off about that is I don't tend to like to worry that much. I have enough neuroticism in my life already. I prefer sort of focusing on things that I can do. And so what I wanted to, before we take some more questions from the audience, I wanted to go to each of you and ask you basically two questions. So one of them is, what type of policy or other kind of intervention do you think is the most important thing to be that you're focusing on doing right now? And I will say, most important thing for you to be focusing on. We will not infer your prioritization as meaning that you think that everybody else should focus on the same thing. But also, like, I want you to offer something that you think is like, for those who are students in the audience, anyone who's kind of thinking about their next research project, we're talking about a transition to a transformative technology. In order to manage that, we're not going to need to be doing a lot of research. We need knowledge that we don't yet have. What do you think are the things that you really want to know that if you could extend your own agency and do a deep research that lasted 4 years and was as good as a great PhD student, what prompt would you give it? So we'll start with Sam.
Sure. Okay, so you mentioned you don't want to worry about new things and think about positive opportunities. I think one of the most...
I could be pessimistic.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but
no, I'm with you.
I want to be
I don't want to be negative. Exactly. I want to be active and forward-looking and solution-oriented and thinking about what the good, what we should be aiming for. And I think, we still live in a world where we have 800 million people living in extreme poverty, and we're talking about a transition to this technology that's supposed to bring about abundance, right? But like, much of the world doesn't have the fundamental digital infrastructure, access to computing resources, access to skills and education and these things that allow one to sort of capture all these economic and societal benefits. And so the thing I'm thinking about at the moment now is, what types of things should we be doing to make it more likely that the economic growth, these health benefits, societal benefits can be accelerated and into kind of low resource parts of the world. This may sound crazy because we just talked about how USAID is scrapped, but I actually do think that if we want that if we want to work towards that type of future where we are accelerating the distribution of benefits from these systems here, I do think you do want to focus on some of these most powerful actors, the U.S. government, the big frontier companies. I think compute is going to be incredibly important, and the distribution of computing resources around the world is going to be incredibly important. And so trying to find overlap between the motivations of these powerful actors, their own self-interest and strategic motivations, with those of the rest of the world and emerging markets around the world, the global majority countries, is like the thing I'm most interested in at the moment, and want to push forward on. In terms of what PhD students should do, I would say, one thing I would love for you to do is come be a fellow at GovAI. We have great programs that several people here have been through, which is awesome. I think basically thinking about these, global benefit distribution, and also this like strategic stability question that I asked the question to Ben about the other day. Like, what is the geopolitical competition? Like, what are we aiming for? And once the U.S. has this lead in AI development, this economic lead that is often talked about, or is the goal. What happens like the day after we've achieved and you've kind of won that race, and thinking more critically about the vision of success there, I think would be something I'd be psyched to see more students work on.
Excellent, thank you. Justin.
Yeah, I think a few things. One, things around transparency. I mean, to go back to the point earlier, a lot of the cutting edge work is being done in large corporations, and they have voluntarily been transparent on some things, but not on others. And I think if that's where the innovation is going to be, we need better rules on what needs to be disclosed and at what point. Right now we have this method of system cards, which are pretty good, but they're completely voluntary. So I think more in that direction. Another policy would be getting clear about liability. So as we move into a world with AI agents, who's liable for their behavior and under what circumstances, and in what ways do liability law and tort law need to be updated, and in what ways does what we have now, is it sufficient? In terms of like future-oriented projects, one thing I'm really interested in, and we just launched a project on this yesterday, is thinking about the social contract in a world where you have AGI agents out in the world engaging in the political sphere and engaging in the economic sphere, and what new norms might that look like. And then the final is moving past the vibe evaluations. You can quote Rumman on that one, because a lot of this stuff depends on good understanding of what the models can do. If we're going to hold them liable, if we're going to ask them to be transparent, we need a much better scientific understanding of how to evaluate those things. And so we need to move past the vibe evaluations.
I'm going to give a 2.5 research project. So one, building on what Sam was saying, I would also add, what are the institutions needed for individuals who will, let's say, like, imagine a world in which, everybody can get access to these technologies, et cetera. That actually does not solve the problem of global inequality. Just because a child in rural Bangladesh gets access to an education app truly does not mean that child is going to get the same job as somebody who went to Stanford, right? That's not the answer. And I see a lot of sort of hand waving over like ... and inequality's gone. So fill in that ... What are the institutions we will need to truly enable a child from rural Bangladesh who will, let's say, have the same access to the internet and, AI agents to help them and to teach them whatever, to then be able to be globally competitive for high value jobs as a kid who grew up in Palo Alto, right? Because there's so much about growing up in Palo Alto that has nothing to do with access to technology. And that is not going away. So that's number one. Second is actually, Justin a little bit took mine, but I'm going to build on no, it's fine. The evaluations thing, very specifically, while I do not think we need a new science of evaluations, it's a paper that just came out. I don't think so, actually. I'm a measurement person. There is a lot in the very basics of measurement science that is truly just not being done today. So anybody who is studying quantitative social science, hit me up also, because I desperately need people who think about problems that way in human intelligence, to translate that into tools that we can use to evaluate AI models. So there's this amazing opportunity to take that measurement science and build it into evaluation tools. My point 5 actually has almost kind of nothing to do with what we talked about today, but one of the societal transformations I actually think a lot about is cultural homogenization. So technology is by definition sort of centralizing. And we already have terms for things like Instagram face, TikTok voice, right? Once we have all sort of started using a technology, there's sort of a way we act, talk, think, our preferences end up getting shaped. And as I think everyone on this panel travels the world a lot, one of the saddest things I've actually seen over the last many years I've been traveling is things are looking more and more alike, because so much of our media is designed in a way, and then we get accustomed to doing things a particular way. What might it look like to preserve individual cultural nuances, just individuality in general, in a world that is technologically mediated?
Yeah, plus one to all of this. And speaking of 2.5, you should check out the latest Gemini as well. It's very good. So I think my 3 points would be, I think the first one is, of all the tribes that Justin kind of laid out earlier, I think the DAC one has some very interesting ideas in terms of actually proactively building more defensive technologies that kind of end up preempting some of what we might see in the future. So if you think about things along the lines of biorisk or so on, or even in terms of kind of, financial systems, so there's a lot of things that can be built now, or infrastructure, or at least thought about, to help kind of preempt these things and have, differential technological development to kind of mitigate the potential risks we might see from more advanced systems in the future. The second thing I'd point out is there's this great multi-author paper that I contributed to with the Cooperative AI Foundation on multi-agent systems. So I think a lot of the discourse, a lot of the thinking is often on the model or sometimes the agent. But I think there's something to be said about zooming out and looking at the interactions of a lot of different types of agents and what these kind of interactions lead to in terms of emergent dynamics or behaviors, whether risky or on the kind of more positive side. So I think this kind of zoomed out approach, and again, this is not new. You had agent-based modeling in economics for a while and so on, but I think a lot of these insights can now be kind of refreshed with these new systems that can actually be tested. And then thirdly, I'll kind of mention alignment again, because I think alignment remains an important question of AI safety. There are different ways of thinking about the alignment problem, or whether you look at it from a kind of more systemic perspective, or at the kind of model level. But I think AI safety remains a pretty important area. I agree there's been a lot of unnecessary doom. It's certainly not my median or model outcome, but I think the tail risks are still important. And as you do get to AGI and potentially after that to ASI, there are a lot of interrogation marks in terms of how do all of these kind of systems interact, and what does that mean for kind of human agency? And I think all these three, remain important problems to think about today.
Yeah, thank you, Seb. Yeah, absolutely agree with you on that last point, especially. Okay, so I'm going to take a few questions here from that have been submitted through the QR code. I also want to encourage people to come up to the microphones. I will ask if you have already asked a question to cede to somebody who hasn't, if you're in, but you're absolutely welcome to have a go. And if no one else does, then that's fine. Okay, so one question that has come up on here a couple of times, and I think is worth talking about with you, Rumman, is in a way the question that kind of some of the online wars of early 2023 were fought about, and not to sort of pick at old scabs, but how can it be appropriate to pay attention to these forthcoming risks from more capable AI systems when there are so many harms to be considering now? So there's the concern that fundamentally there is something zero-sum in play here, and that any attention on these topics is taking it away from those. So would you like to address that?
Yeah, so first, I think very few things are actually zero-sum. When we talk about impact on jobs, many things, these things are not zero-sum. I will say that there did feel like there was a moment where the air just got sucked out of the room and you weren't allowed to talk about a lot of things anymore. I'll also add that actually some of these, if you really think about what is underlying some of these, even the most extreme doomer fears, right? It fundamentally can be boiled down to some of the problems that we need to address today, right? If we're going to talk about a world in which AI crushes us all, maybe let's deal with a world in which AI systems are not discriminatory to particular groups, because then maybe, just maybe, we will have a path forward to thinking about a more sophisticated system that may quote unquote crush us all, right? If you're worried about the paperclip maximizer, right? Then maybe think about a world in which you're designing better measurements of successful output of a model so that, your social media algorithm does not result in a lot of polarization, right? So I do think that the fundamental paradigms on these problems are actually quite similar to each other. So one path forward in thinking about it's not either or, it's if we think about the constructs of the problems today, they may help us solve problems of tomorrow.
Thank you. So one nice example of that, I think, is the question of how we build infrastructure for AI agents in such a way as to kind of reduce the prospects of power concentration that also themselves might lead to kind of further downstream risks. Justin, can you talk about some of the initiatives that have taken place in the last, like we've seen a number of different proposals in the last few months. MCP, for example, the Model Context Protocol, various different agent-to-agent communication protocols. Like what do you think is kind of necessary to establish an ecosystem for AI agents that addresses kind of both the risks that we're facing from those over the next couple of years, but also those that might be associated with much more capable systems?
Yeah, it's maybe a better question for Seb, all things considered. I mean, he's really...
Seth, who wrote a paper called Infrastructure for AI Agents.
I'm moderating though.
The thing that I would say, and then I would love to get Seb's take, is these questions around liability feel like a meaningfully important one to be able to actually deploy agents, and you know who's responsible for their bad behavior, what rules they're going to follow, making sure that you can demonstrably show that they're behaving within their guardrails, following those rules, and there's a clear understanding of what happens when they go outside of them would be like what I would say quickly, but I would love to hear Seb's take if that's okay.
Yeah, I think there's, there are more and more papers, I think, on this coming out. And I think one of the early ones was Alan Chan's paper on, identity systems, I think, for agents. And I think that's a very great place to start. Just make sure you can kind of at least track and know the agents you have kind of deployed, where they are, what they do, and being able to kind of like shut them off if needed. That does potentially pose some questions around open source agents. But in general, I think that's a very good first point of call. This week also, I think Google put out an agent-to-agent kind of protocol standard out. And I think standardizing the interaction between these agents, I think, is going to help, again, progress some degree of stability and safety in the field, as well as being able to kind of understand how authentication works between kind of agents. And, how do you ensure that kind of an agent broadly stays in its lane, or that the tools it kind of calls and so on remains kind of known only to that agent and not divulged to other agents and so on. So I think a lot of these questions are being thought about right now. And, this kind of protocol is one example, but there's been others out there. There's been a paper, one called Agora, I think, which is another agent protocol. And yeah, I think these are some examples of what we might want with agents. So I think that'd be my first kind of...
Okay, so we're going to take a few questions from the floor and make sure we can then sort of wrap up more or less on time so people can catch trains. So if you would like to state your name and ask a question. I'm laughing because she's one of my best friends, so
yes.
I don't want to indicate that.
Phenomenal panel, Seth. Thank you, everyone. My name's Meg Young. I'm at Data and Society, and my question is that there have been many visions shared in the conference about AI is folded into the coming future and its transformative potential, but I'd like to understand what is that vision when we take some of the material resources that it demands into account, and do those represent a hard limit, or should we instead think about the ways that it's going to gate access to who will have access to these transformative systems? Is it better to imagine it not as permeated through every factor of society, but really just narrowly deployed where resources allow?
Thank you. Once we've had a couple more, I'm going to allocate them to you individually. Sam, prepared to think about that one. Bo?
Hi, my name is Boran Viliamla. Thank you for this exciting conversation. There is a paper in the collection by Hari Hahn and Henry Farrell reminding and inviting AI researchers to embrace and think more seriously about just how messy democracies can be. So instead of thinking of democracies as having very, very nice, formal models focused on things like deliberation, thinking of democracies instead as involving groups that have deeply different interests, that engage in things that are ugly, like negotiation and so on and so forth. And I happen to think that this topic of transformative AI and AGI call for the exact same thing. There's a need for us to bring this kind of thinking about diversity of ideas and the messiness of the topic. And so, my question is, first, where do you see a need for engaging with the messiness of this topic more deeply? And secondly, where do you see a need for better science in thinking about this topic?
Okay, thank you. Rumman, that will be going to you in a moment. And MH?
Thanks for the great panel. Very thought-provoking. I really like the comment I think Rumman made early on about how intelligence in the AI world is often linked up with productivity. And I wonder if there's a way of reimagining intelligence and maybe even there are many different vague definitions of AGI, maybe even like radically changing how we think about AGI in terms of democratic freedoms. So like, are there ways we can think about either evaluating, we have ways of measuring, there are ways of measuring the democraticness of countries, which is very like aggregate and takes like lots of time. But like, can we imagine ways of either evaluating models at like kind of an individual model level, or even, analysis of those systems, economic analysis that measures its intelligence in terms of its support of democratic functions?
Nice. That's going to go to you, Justin. Over there.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I just wanted to circle back quickly on Seb and Justin's paper on AGI and free societies. One of the things that's at the top of my mind is how the transition to an agent-based political economy might lead to the overwhelming of state capacity. So just overwhelming court systems and patent offices, overwhelming the inboxes of political representatives, notice and comments in the federal system, and just progressively weaken and erode our pulse in the information network to know sort of what people think, want, and need. And in your paper, you outline a number of different ways in which you can use AI to develop alternative governance systems. But before jumping ship, I just wanted to know if you have any sort of concrete either policy or technical pathways to future-proof existing institutions against this kind of like state overwhelming risk.
Okay, great. Seb will take that one. And one last question.
Hi, I'm Diane. I'm Safety Product Manager at Cohere. Rumman, I loved your point about the opportunity for different ACs and different governments around the world to kind of step into a vacuum. One of the obvious challenges with alignment, especially alignment to democratic values, is there is actually no single model of how democracy should work, right? And even how free speech, since we're at the Knight Institute, how free speech is exercised conforms to different societal norms in different countries that are democratic. So I wonder, from your point of view on the governance and regulatory side, or for any of the panelists, what are the sort of maybe international regional bodies that are best suited to help guide this kind of, not necessarily consensus, but some kind of agreement, whether it's bodies or models? Like, very curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Nice. So that's really a question that everyone can kind of think of in your broader answers. And speaks very much to the nature of the conference as a whole. Okay, so we'll go through these in the order that we received them. So Sam, if you'd like to respond to Meg's question.
Yeah, so...
And also, I'll ask you to keep it to like 1 minute max.
1 minute? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so Meg mentioned, how, it takes a lot of resources to use these systems. How might we go about distributing access to these, right, to enable, more, deal with this kind of inequality problem. I guess I was also mentioning the resources part as well. And I think we haven't actually really talked about the sustainability impacts of these systems. And I think that was implied there. Okay. Yeah. I think I guess I worry that this might actually be, increasingly true. Like, I think people have been really excited about the prospect of inference scaling leading to, like being a really big driver of future capabilities and utility of these systems. And if it's the case, then that means at the point of use, you need to squeeze more juice out of the systems to make it more useful for whatever you're trying to achieve. You need to pay more to run the system for longer. It means these things are being even more kind of resource intensive at the point of use. I guess this just to me points towards like, how do we distribute computing resources? I don't have like good ideas for that, but it seems like a fundamental question to get creative about. Do we want to think about like property rights over future AI agents, so some share of inference compute? How do we deal with all the geopolitical realities of scarce compute resources, and then kind of align incentives between different actors? I don't have good answers, but I think it's like worth trying to think through on the usage side, especially around compute being the main thing to distribute. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Rumman, Bo's question was to ask you to engage with the messiness, which is someone who has led thousands of people in red teaming language models you presumably are quite used to. So go for it.
Yeah, so I'm going to do a Marie Kondo quote, like, I like mess. No, it's 100% true. I think so much of technology is about having clean, optimized, fast, easy outcomes that we forget that actually most of democratic processes are about aligning with messy, slow, and often like seemingly unproductive, interactions. And the purpose of that is to get a wide range of perspectives in the room. The purpose of that is to reach people who maybe don't understand or have access to the technology. Kind of to Meg's point in her first statement, like the reality of the situation is like most people in the world don't interact with AI. They don't really know anything about it. Like we're in a very rarefied universe of people who like think, act, and use AI systems. Like I live part-time in Texas. I can promise you none of my neighbors know or really care about AI, right? And this is like in America. So, thinking through what these processes might be, I think it's interesting, and also even to the question that was afterwards of how can we think about agents not as mediators of consensus building, which is a lot of what I've seen in the sort of AI and democracy space, which is how can we reduce friction to consensus building, but also maybe embrace some of that difficulty and messiness. I know Spencer had to leave, but Spencer Overton's been doing a bunch of work on this, specifically thinking through minoritized groups and their engagement in these AI-driven democratic processes.
Thank you. Okay, so Seb, I think it was Justin first. MH's question about measuring and evaluating the capabilities of these systems in terms of democratic freedoms.
Yeah. So one good thing in this direction is we've already started trying to do this globally and thinking about quality of life years, well-being indices. So instead of tying things to productivity or GDP, we could tie them to these things that we've already started trying to measure with other things going on in the economy. So I think that's like one promising way. The other thing I wanted to address the question about mine and Seb's paper, which is I think there are like, you can improve democratic input on organization so that the bureaucracy is responding better to democratic input is one thing. We talk a little bit about hybrid institutions. So you like keep the kind of current institutions we have, but you integrate sort of augmented decision-making as part of them. So I think there are some promising directions and would be happy to talk more about it.
One last little thing. So from Seb, that actually is very helpful because it means that you can respond to Diane's question. And again, I refer you to your recent tweet about pluralism and aligning models to individuals as opposed to larger groups.
Right. I never realized my Twitter would. Well, there's a few things. The first thing I'd say is that actually a lot of these questions that touch on, complexity, messiness, different conceptions of, democracy, clashing values, and so on. I think these are all very true, and I also very much like the messiness, the complexity of the world as we have it. And I think this is not a design flaw. It is how it is. I mean, to kind of make sense of it as it is. And so there's a paper I really like by Joel Lebo and many others called "A Theory of Appropriateness for Generative Artificial Intelligence," and I think makes a lot of very good claims in descriptions of how we can think about these questions. Even the alignment problem is how do we cohabit, how do we live together better, both between humans and different humans, but also between humans and AIs and so on. I think that's a very interesting frame to look at things and to rethink through coordination problems, cooperation, competition, and so on. And in terms of the question around kind of institutions as they are today, I think they are already overwhelmed, and there's a big question of state capacity these days that I think remains, one of, I think, in my mind, one of the most important things to look at. Even when I worked in government 5 years ago or so, it's worse on the inside than it looks like on the outside. And so, if there's no adults in the room, maybe you want to have a few AIs in the room sometimes. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think there's going to be loads of opportunity. If government does not actually use and adopt these systems, they will, by definition, struggle and lag because the rest of society will, companies will, B2B will, and individuals will, criminals will. And so it's going to be actually quite critical to use and adopt these systems to make sense of the complexity, the scale, and the breadth of the challenges at play. And so I agree. I think institutions are ossifying and decaying. I think Fukuyama had some great work on this, and I think that's an important challenge with or without AI. I just think that AI can play an important role in improving that as well. But it's not just an AI thing. People have been trying to do this for a long time, and I think we need to do better at this as well.
Okay, we do have to wrap up. I want to say, just in response to your question, Diane, that the problem of how to deal with moral disagreement is really one of the central questions of political philosophy over the last 400 years. And it's just, and you're actually sat next to someone who can, a PhD student in political philosophy, who you should have a quick conversation with at the end. I think there's lots of resources that can be drawn on there. Okay, so we are going to have closing remarks. Okay. All right. So we're going to have closing remarks now from Katie, but I did just want to sort of thank the panel for a really stimulating. I could have kept going. That was great. Thank you.